Okay, I hope that everything works on my side. I'm streaming now to YouTube, so we can start.
All right, cool. Let me share my screen. Cool. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So basically, what I'm going to present is the backtesting section out of this book, Advances in Financial Machine Learning by Prado. So I'm going to present basically a complete section of the book, which is quite like a big chunk. So first of all, what I'm going to focus on is not so much the math itself, because Prado can be very math heavy, but for this whole, for all these chapters, I think it would not make sense to go in too deep. But what I'm going to focus on is like the ideas. In the backtesting section, generally more towards ideas than math, but yeah, this is what I want to focus on. In general, I'm gonna include 5 out of 7 of these chapters. I'm gonna leave out the first and the last one, simply because it's just borderline in this backtesting area, and we're not doing that, to be honest. Like bet sizing, for example, we're not doing this at the moment. Yeah, generally it's just, for example, this bet sizing chapter is basically just a bunch of ways you could do this properly if you wanted to. But yeah, like I'm gonna go over the main chapters now. And let's dive right in. So first, he's talking about the dangers of backtesting, basically. So these are basically the classical things that you need to watch out when doing backtesting. These are the standard issues that people typically run in. I'm gonna go over them quickly, just so I don't know, like how deep you all are into this. Survivorship bias is basically the idea that you're only selecting the projects or the stocks or whatever that still made it, that didn't go broke or anything. So in our case, we, for example, have that a lot, where we just pick the top 50 by market cap and do any kind of trading strategy on them. But this already, for example, includes some kind of bias, because we are taking the top 50 by market cap by now, basically. So already there's a bias, because these are the top 50 projects, basically, where we know they ended up in the top 50 in the end. So they, by definition, had to basically do better than the rest of them over the recent time. Look ahead bias is like a classical one, where you include data that you shouldn't have. We typically exclude that by this shift, by this lag in our backtests, for example, where you always try to not predict today's price by today's features, but you try to predict tomorrow's price by today's features, basically. Storytelling, also, I guess, we're sometimes guilty of that, where you basically, in hindsight, or generally try to fit stories or fit information to patterns that are not really there. Crypto news or finance news do that a lot, where the price just changes a lot on a certain day, and then they look what happened today to figure out what might have caused it, even though maybe that was not related at all. Data mining, data snooping is basically more machine learning. You can, by various ways, can train on on data that you are testing on. And yeah, classicals are the transaction costs, which is, you can calculate that different ways. You can make that very complicated, actually, to have a decent model of what kind of transaction costs you would want to pay. outliers. That is actually also something we run into quite frequently, because basically the when you run a backtest over a long period of time, over several years, it's typically very strong days that influence the performance very strong. So, for example, like these few days in 2019 where the price dropped from $6,000 to $3,000 in a short time. And then basically what you're trying is like you fiddle around with strategy to find parameters where this strategy by accident does not trade on this certain day, and that improves the backtest by a lot. So that's a kind of an issue that you have, that you run into these problems. Yeah, by focusing too much on extreme days or extreme events that might not even reoccur at any time. Last one is shorting. We typically don't short in our backtests because of exactly those reasons. Like shorting is even more difficult to calculate than general transaction costs, and makes it a bit more confusing to interpret. Those are basically the standard, like beginners things to look out for. Then like this is basically like the ideas that Prado had on top of that for the advanced backtest, and he basically starts by saying, well, the problem with all that is even if you become like a true master of backtesting, you by definition must have run thousands of backtests, and that means you're overfitting again, basically by definition. So yeah, as I said, like the maddening thing about backtesting is that the better you become, the more likely you will discover things that are not there, basically, which is a problem. So in the end, like in the beginning, you will run into these. By the way, do you see my cursor? Or should I use this?
Yes.
I do.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, so in the beginning, it's going to be like the classical mistakes, and in the end, like when you're getting better, you still have issues because you basically then overfit quite extremely often. So that's kind of like the problem. I've also seen like basically this is really like two layers that we've seen when we, for example, published this article about this easiest backtest, where I think also Dino wrote something about that you can basically literally test thousands of strategies in a very short time. And I was like, yeah, but should you though? You know, it's kind of like this thing. Backtesting is definitely necessary, especially for like, if you say like people who just hear something off YouTube, some guy says this works, then you definitely kind of want to try it for yourself and run some kind of test. So in this level, doing some verification definitely makes sense, but the more and more you get into, the more you run into this problem of selecting or like finding stuff that isn't basically there. And Prado made this reference to this lottery winning, basically, that there is a lot of even published papers, a lot of authors who claim that they found alpha, when instead what they've really found was the lottery ticket that won the last game. And I think that's a pretty good comparison, basically, that you overfit to something that would have worked historically, but might not work in the future, actually. Yeah, so basically what he's saying is not all is lost, definitely, but the idea is that you want to discard bad models and not improve them. So basically, you want to use backtesting as a like a tool for evaluation, but not as a research tool where you actively try and always backtest and see what you can tune to improve the backtest. It's basically the same context in machine learning, where you have overfitting, right? You train on your training set, and then you test that on your test set to see how good you were, and then you tune the model, and then you test on your test set again, and test and test and test, and in the end you're optimizing on the test set, and then you're overfitting. That's the general problem here. So yeah, backtest overfitting can be defined as the selection bias on multiple backtests. Yeah, so basically you run a ton of backtests and then pick the one that did the best, which is not optimal. And then basically Prado gives out some recommendations on what you can do to avoid that. First one is to basically develop models on asset classes and not single projects, and we kind of do that by testing, you know, like, does the model technically work not only on Bitcoin but on Ethereum as well, and on EOS or whatever. Of course, we kind of in practice run into the problem that, like, the more you get into the altcoins, the more noisy it gets. But generally, that is a good practice to see if something works for different projects, not necessarily for all of them, because, like, the farther we go into the weird coins, it probably won't work anymore. But yeah. Second is applying bagging, which is more of a machine learning methodology. Basically, you would train a lot of models on parts of the data, not all of it, and on parts of the features or the metrics. So you wouldn't give any model all of the features, all of the metrics. You would give them some, and then in the end take, like, what the average prediction was, and that is typically kind of clean of a little bit of overfitting, basically. Yeah, the third is basically this idea: do not, or this general recommendation, do not backtest until you have all your research completed. Which basically means it's backtesting is really, in the end, it's supposed to be like an evaluation tool. And in the beginning of the book, actually in the first chapters, he also mentions he also argues that you definitely should have different sections in, like, a normal investment firm. You would want to have different groups. One is only responsible for generation of data, like the metrics, the feature engineering. Then you have some people who are only doing the strategies out of that, who are generating strategies. And then you have separate people who are only doing backtesting. And then when you have a strategy research that seems to, or that looks good, then you give that to the backtesting team, and then they say yes or no, basically. They shouldn't also, like, shouldn't even give feedback or something, like, try to improve this. Like, if the strategy doesn't work, destroy it and start over, basically. That's, like, the optimal way. Of course, in practice, there's kind of a mean way to it, yeah. Fourth recommendation is record every backtest you concluded. So there's ways that we're going into later, like the deflated Sharpe ratio, where you kind of account for how many tests you did. So it makes sense to keep track of how many tests you did. Of course, that kind of comes late for us in our case, but yeah, we should maybe start with that. Fifth is simulate scenarios rather than history, which refers to what comes next. Basically, maybe the normal walk forward backtest might not be the best. I'm going to go into that next. And yeah, as I said, like, if the backtest fails, then start from scratch. Don't try to optimize too much. If it says it doesn't work, then try a different strategy, not improve the one that is probably not working. All right. Yeah, so the next chapters basically talk about 3 different paradigms of backtesting. The one is the classical one, the walk forward backtest, which basically is the one we are typically doing. You go through it in like time way. You split it and train the model on the earlier parts and test it on the later. You can do kind of a walk forward, which we did, for example, for the fundamental model, where you start at the beginning and you take a first chunk of the data and train, and then try to predict a chunk of the next part of data. And then you add this to the earlier and train on this and try to predict the next. And so you walk forward in time, basically. Yeah, this is like the standard way. And now he comes up with this cross-validation idea for it. Because he argues, yeah, as I said, like in the normal walk forward style, we just go through one scenario, just one timeline, basically. And as I said earlier, maybe you might overfit on some outliers, some extreme values that may never return, but you're trying to kind of adapt to that, even though it's not really anything that will repeat. Yeah. And yeah, as I said, like it's not necessarily representative for future performance, basically. And also the argument is that you start on relatively small parts of training. If you do the walk forward method, you train on relatively small parts in the beginning, and then the training data grows, basically, which is the case for machine learning purposes. For, you know, when we're talking about like normal strategies, this might not be 100% true, but yeah. All right, yeah, and then he basically goes over to the idea of this cross-validation, which is generally the idea to simulate over scenarios, so-called scenarios, or he approaches it like that. So you can think, instead of just looking at the historical performance, we can ask, how would my trading algorithm for stocks would have performed in 2008 during the crash, basically. And then you can do basically like this. If you have your data like this, and then you can basically test, train the model on all the data before that, before the test, and all the data afterwards, actually, and see how it would have performed in 2008, basically. It's kind of a thing I thought that wouldn't be allowed, but he says it's okay, basically. This is basically the idea of cross-validation, is something like this, where you split your data into, in this case, 5 chunks, and then you test on one chunk and train on the other, and then you take another as a test chunk and train on those, everyone around those, and test on that one test set, and then that way you go through it, basically. So he says this kind of classical cross-validation thing works for finance. You just have to look out for some stuff. First of all, would be that typically you would shuffle the data and then split it into test and train chunks. But for finance, of course, for time series, you want to keep the time integrity somewhat intact. So you keep the continuity of the data, and just switch the test chunk, basically. What you also want to do, I'll come back to these slides, but yeah, like what he says is you can do that as long as you do a few things, which, aside from removing the trend and such, would be this purging and embargo, he calls it. So what this means is, purging basically is kind of cleaning up a problem that he himself created, like himself, basically by using these 3, how's it called? The thing we're going to learn next time, basically, the upper, lower, and sideways bound labeling. So you're not trying to predict the price of tomorrow, basically, but you're trying to predict whether the price in the future will hit like a top or a stop loss, or just go sideways until we get stopped out, basically. So you kind of need to account for that, because that would mean you have overlap if you split into train and test set. Exactly. So you kind of need to, between the train and test splits, need to remove some chunk to avoid these overlaps that we generate. Another thing that generates this overlap would be this fractional differencing that he also proposed, where you include some historical data into the price data. So you kind of need to purge some data before it. And the second thing basically is called this embargo, is the argument that especially for, since there is some correlation over time, you want to, especially after your test set, make an especially long piece of time that you take out to avoid this. Because, yeah, there's a lot of correlation to this, and you kind of don't want any of the test information in your training set, basically. So his argument, as long as you do these things, you basically are able to do this cross-validation the way this is done here. And then he goes basically crazy. And on top of that says, well, we can, like in this case, we're only using one test set. We're cutting this in 5 and use one chunk to test. If we cut it into more pieces, basically, we can also use multiple test sets out of this area. So here, this was super confusing to me, to be honest. But what this means is, like, you have these ways to split it, and in this case you would have 6 groups. Like, instead of 5, you would have 6, and these are ways to, in case we use 2 test sets, to distribute that. So either you have like the first 2, so in this case we would have this as a test set and this, and then train on this, or you can have the first and the third, so this and this. And these are ways to go through this. And then you can generate different paths out of that, which honestly I did not fully understand. And just generate a ton of tests, basically. Out of these, you can always generate Sharpe ratios. And in the end, you have a large amount of Sharpe ratios generated, and can basically generate a distribution of Sharpe ratios and calculate what would be your estimated average Sharpe ratio. So you have like some estimate, some better estimate of what the Sharpe ratio might be. And also you can combine that, as I said, like with the deflated Sharpe ratio, where you have like a minimum that we're gonna see later, where you have like can estimate what kind of Sharpe ratio you want to have at least to be significant. I hope that was somewhat understandable. You're still following me so far?
Yes.
Any questions?
Yes.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, next thing. So the third thing after normal walk forward backtesting and backtesting on cross-validation, he's proposing this backtesting on synthetic data, so on artificially created data, which sounds kind of strange. It is also kind of strange. But yeah, so this, he kind of like breaks it down, and from now on thinks of trading strategies a bit different, where he's saying generally investment strategies can be defined as an algorithm that postulates the existence of a market inefficiency. So there is some structure that makes it possible to beat the market, basically. And he says, while strategies can be various strategies, the tactics stay typically kind of the same. So as tactics, he kind of defines these thresholds. So taking profit on stop loss. This is kind of what you always need to include. This would be like the triple barrier thing we had earlier, where you always define some kind of stop loss and some maximum profit where you get out, and some maximum loss where you get out. And technically, you can reduce then this whole thing to have basically a gamble, right? Like there's two options that can happen. Either it gets, the profit is taken, or we're stopped out. So, and if you always take profit and stop loss at the same rate of returns, we basically have a gamble that is one or another, basically, with a certain probability. With a certain probability, we earn this because we take profit, or we lose this because we get stopped out. And this is kind of how he reduces things to make it more calculatable. Yes, so as I said, we have these thresholds, take profit and stop loss, and these are typically calculated from historical simulations. So you basically historically run a multiple of tests with different stop losses and take profits, and you could estimate what might be a good stop loss and a good take profit. This, he says, is kind of problematic because, again, there's basically no guarantee that this might work in the future. And really what you kind of want to avoid overfitting is to train this on the underlying stochastic process. So, wait a second. So yeah, so you kind of want to see the underlying stochastic probabilistic process and train on that, so you kind of get the optimal without overfitting to this. And in this case, normally you would do something like when you're doing this, when you have a stochastic process that you sample out of, you do something like a random walk. Maybe Brownian movement is something you've heard of, but generally it's just like the generating of data out of a model that you fit to the data, and mathematicians in finance like that a lot, this idea, because then it's basically like this underlying process, and the rest is just noise around that. And here he postulates, or he suggests this Ornstein-Ullbeck process, which is more or less just a random walk, basically, with a bit of a drift, a bit of a trend to it. So you can fit this process to the data. In this case, this would be a OU process that starts at 10:10. So we initiate it at 10 and 10. And then we let it walk, basically, and it has a mean, in this case, of 0, 0. And so it basically does like a random walk, but with a tendency to walk towards this mean of 0, 0. That's kind of the idea. So it's like, as I said, a random walk with a bit of a tendency to go to. And this might be, for example, a good way to kind of estimate our data. And you can fit this process to the data and then generate basically a ton of data. And you can test this for different stop losses and take profits, and can generate this heat map, basically. So you can test what makes a lot of sense, what kind of combination of take profit and stop loss makes a lot of sense. This color coding is the Sharpe ratio. So here would be around like a 3, Sharpe ratio of 3, and you would get negative. Yeah, so this is basically how you can kind of estimate like these take profit and stop loss rules for your data without totally overfitting to it, to some kind of random extreme behavior or something. In this case, this would be the mean it gravitates to, like this mean. maybe that's kind of interesting. This would mean basically, on average, our strategy, we're expecting the price or the trend not to go up or down, but to go sideways, basically. And for this, it actually suggests something interesting that would be some very high stop loss. So we accept a lot of loss before we get out, and a very short profit taking. So we take, whenever we're slightly in the green, basically we take it out. Which might sound like a weird rule, but as I said, like we're kind of expecting it to go sideways more or less. And this would be, I think a good example would be to trade stablecoins, for example. So in this case, you would argue that the price is always gonna have a center, basically. So you basically set a large stop loss, so you basically rarely stop out, and you argue at some point I'm going to go back into the green because it's stable, and you can just take that profit, basically. So this would be might be an interesting strategy for stablecoin trading. Yeah, so that's the general idea. Instead of testing stop and stop losses and take profits out of historic data, we kind of simulate it and go from there. Yeah, there was a question.
I have one question. Can you explain the parameters in this equation, this process?
Not too well. I think. Wait. No. This was also just an example. But basically, it is what you can imagine it as being like a Brownian movement with a drift to it. Can't really go into that much because I'm not too deep into those processes.
Okay.
So if you want to apply this to a given strategy, should you derive the mean from the historical prices of this asset?
Yeah. So I guess I'm also, as I said, like not too sure about this, but I guess you would kind of like tell it we start at, I don't know, at 0, and overall the strategy like historically generated a return of I don't know, 50% over a year. So you would kind of make it drift towards this plus 50%, but with a more or less random walk. So you kind of say, yeah, we estimate these parameters with like how much how volatile it is, and derive it from there. So I'm also not the greatest fan of this, because I always think like, yeah, but with synthetic data, the idea is like it's only as good as your model of the data is in the end. So yeah, I personally also would say, like, for us, the more interesting thing might be this, that we take into use like maybe some of these cross-validation ideas. I mean, we've done cross-validation like in the metrics analyzer, right? Maybe we can include some of these ideas here. With this, I'm not too sure, to be honest. Yeah. Outside from maybe, yeah.
I don't know. To me, it kind of makes sense. So the question is, how do you set your stop loss and take profit? So, I mean, you have to make some assumption, right? So you have to have some model in mind when you do that.
Yeah. I mean, in this case, he just suggested to take to do a grid search over different combinations of stop loss and take profit. So he didn't go too deep into this, but yeah.
And this stop losses and profit taking, actually, this is used for the labeling after that, right? For the triple barrier method.
Yeah. In this case, problem is kind of we'll go into that later. Yeah, then the question is, in this case, how would you, like, you need to at least add the third thing, right? Because it's triple barrier, so you actually also for this case would need to add
a time limit. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, well, probably there is some discussion about picking a time limit, I guess. The time limit is also dependent on how much trading you want to do. Like, is it more high frequency or less frequent?
Yeah. That is actually also something he goes in later, that this also makes a huge difference basically in how in effect on your Sharpe ratio basically, in combination with this, how likely is a positive return, how likely is a stop loss, and then you can basically calculate what your Sharpe ratio would be and what your probability of success needs to be basically, and how you can maybe improve that by adding more trades to it. Yeah. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, so that was basically these 3 ways of doing backtests, or these 3 paradigms. And now we're going to general backtesting statistics. So general numbers to evaluate your backtest. These basically can be used for all of these 3 paradigms. Some of them are the general standard finance metrics, others are more machine learning specific. Generally, we have these categories in statistics. More general characteristics, performance, runs and drawdowns, implementation shortfalls, return risk efficiency, which is like Sharpe ratios, attributions, which is like the correlations to specific markets, and classification scores, which is precision and stuff. I'm going to go into these a bit more in detail now. Yeah, so general characteristics. He basically also just described a bunch of these statistics. So we have general time range, average asset under management, so the average investment, how large it is, what's the capacities for this, how much leverage do we have, maximum sizes, ratio of longs. In our case, we typically only have longs, so it's not so interesting. Yeah, the frequency of bets, and yeah, as I said, like this might be kind of interesting to also include, and yeah, average holdings periods, annualized turnover. Correlation to underlying is also kind of something that we might want to look more, but it's also more if you're, for example, if you're including shorting, you should always maybe check how strong does your strategy actually correlates to the underlying asset, because if it's like totally highly negatively correlated, then maybe you just short the underlying asset and let strategy go altogether. I feel like we kind of like address this by always comparing to a holding as a benchmark, for example. Yeah, so not too out of the ordinary. Also, like the performance is basically all the performances without risk adjustments. So the dollars earned from long positions, annualized rate of return. Hit ratio is kind of interesting. The whole idea that we maybe like how many, get basically the idea of accuracy, right? Like how many of our trades are actually successful versus how many are unsuccessful. I think that might be interesting to include that in some way to a backtest, that we say, okay, how many of these like completed trades were actually successful? And then, yeah, you can average that and for the not misses and stuff, of course. So this might be something interesting for us to add as a small detail to our backtests. Oh yeah, this was just like me ranting about Prado's general way of doing things. This is his formula.
Just
for
one thing.
Yep.
Just to stress from what you said. So apparently there is a standard that investment companies use to report on their strategies. This GIPS, Global Investment Performance Standards. So yeah.
No worries.
So yeah, I mean, just wanted to point that out. When we are asking, okay, what metrics we should give to potential clients to evaluate our tests, well, there is a standard for that. I'm just looking at it now, so the latest version is 125 pages. But it is there, so that's good for us.
Was there something not working?
No, it's working.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this was just, as I said, like me being mad at Prado because this is all he did, this huge formula to basically calculate the annualized returns. This is like how he calculates the normal returns, admittedly with some additions for interest rates and stuff. And then here he just calculates the cumulative product over the whole, with the returns over the whole period of time. And then he actually is supposed to calculate the annualized returns, but he makes a mistake. At least I'm pretty sure that this is not right, because this should not be to the power of y minus y. This should be to the power of 1 over y. So yeah, actually he's bringing in a lot of math to be wrong in the end, where he actually wanted to explain what he does, and this was kind of super annoying me. But yeah, moving on. The next idea are these so-called runs, which is kind of interesting. The maximum drawdown kind of falls under this idea, which is the length of or the analysis of how many times in a row do we go down, basically. So this is like the tendency of trending time series, of course, that you have a lot of ups and a lot of downs in a row, which makes time series analysis kind of difficult for these financial time series. And yeah, so what you can do, basically, the maximum drawdown, as I said, so the number of the worst you can do with the strategy at any given time. So if you were to invest right at the top, unfortunately, I have no image for that, right at the top, and then sold at the worst time at the bottom, how much is the worst thing you could have lost, for example. Time underwater was also something that I found kind of interesting, which is the idea of how much, like, from your original starting point, how long are you in the negative, which of course is more of a psychological metric, but in the end, like, people don't like to be in the negative. And this idea of the return concentration, I also found kind of interesting. Maybe we could have a look into this. The general idea is based on this HHI index, which is designed for how concentrated something is, a market, for example. So is it relatively evenly distributed, or is all the wealth concentrated in a few single wallets, people, or whatever? And his idea was basically to calculate the concentration for only the positive returns and only the negative returns of different trades, basically. So in a way, you could see basically if most of your profits for a strategy, if like a strategy is giving good returns and has a nice Sharpe ratio, but most of the profits are basically gotten or are earned by a few lucky shots, basically, or a few huge returns, that might be a red flag, for example, that you see, okay, like this is not performing well in general overall. It's just it had a few really good bets, basically. And I think that might also be an interesting thing. As I said, with this normal walk forward backtest, we run into this issue that maybe this one Monday in 2019 was really, really bad. But to change your strategy in a way until you kind of are not invested at this specific time is not good for backtesting in general, or for strategies in general. So yeah, that is one idea. Here we have the Sharpe ratios. In the beginning, we have the normal Sharpe ratio, which is just the average return divided by the standard deviation of the returns. So like a measurement of risk to reward. And then he introduces these two others, the probabilistic Sharpe ratio, which basically, yeah, again, I don't want to, like, he also doesn't really explain much about these functions. I have the code. We can run it, but yeah, like, don't want to go too much in the math. But the idea basically for the probabilistic Sharpe ratio is that you give him a benchmark Sharpe ratio, and you can calculate the probability of, and this thing calculates the probability of how certain you are that your Sharpe ratio is above this benchmark Sharpe ratio, basically. And the deflated Sharpe ratio is kind of an advancement of that, where you don't need to define your own benchmark Sharpe ratio, but the result is actually the benchmark Sharpe ratio. So you give him a lot of, for example, if you do a lot of backtesting and you keep track of all of them, and you see all the backtests, maybe through cross-validation, for example, then you could put that in there, and it tells you based on like how many trades how many backtests you already done, like what kind of backtest you would need minimum, what kind of Sharpe ratio you would need minimum to have a significant result. I think I have it somewhere. Maybe. Yeah, this is the code for the deflated Sharpe ratio, and then you give him a mean Sharpe ratio over all the Sharpe ratios you've gotten, the variance of the Sharpe ratio, and the number of trials you did, and it gives you the Sharpe ratio that you need to surpass with one of the backtests to say, okay, this is really interesting. So if I put the average Sharpe ratio a bit higher, the needed Sharpe ratio gets higher, and if I have less trials, for example, the required Sharpe ratio goes down, for example. Yeah, like he's not going too much into the mathematics of it in this chapter. He just says like this is what you can do basically if you do a lot of backtesting to deflate the Sharpe ratio by the means of giving it a kind of a benchmark that you need to come over. Yeah, attribution this was just basically half a page. He was just saying more or less kind of could be interesting to see to what kind of industry, for example, your performance is correlated the most. Are we exposed to the energy sector or the tech sector or whatever? I guess we can do that by normal correlations. And then the classical classification scores, accuracy, precision, recall, F1. I've seen multiple people talk about this already. So the accuracy basically is the standard measure in machine learning. So out of all so this is true positive, true negative. So true positive, you were saying this is a buy signal, for example, buy, and it was actually true. And this is true negative, so you're saying not a buy signal, and that was also true in relations to all the events happening, basically. So all this makes more sense, I think, like if you put it in normal terms, in normal finance terms, the accuracy would be how often were we right in general, like how often when we said this is a buy or this is not a buy, how often were we right. Precision is how often were we right when we said buy, because this is basically more interesting to us when we actually did a trade compared to when we didn't do any trades, basically. How often were we right? And in contrast, the recall was basically how much of the real buy signals did we find? So this is like an important differentiation between precision and recall, basically. How often were we right when we said this is a buy? And how much of the real buys did we actually find? And this is kind of, yeah, typically it gets more important in finance or whenever there's like an unbalanced data set where you have more truths than positives than negatives, for example. And the F1 score, in a nutshell, is basically just an attempt to combine the two, because our brains can handle more than one number, basically. So yeah, machine learning in the end also kind of needs just one number. So this is kind of a way to combine precision and recall in a balanced way. I think this is an attempt to do the harmonic mean on this. But yeah, like to note is just like this is a combination of both. That's why we also multiply, because we don't want to have like just one of those to be very high and one of those to be very low, because that would also not be the desired outcome. All right, and last but not least, we have the chapter 15, understanding strategic risk, strategy risk, which was is very, very mathematical, and he's doing a lot of assumptions here. But he had some interesting ideas. We were talking about that earlier. One interesting suggestion here was also to just say the Sharpe ratio is a function of precision rather than accuracy. So if we go back, it's more precision than actually accuracy, because it's basically, as I said, it's precision takes into account only the ones where we said this is a signal, basically, and how often were we right then. So the Sharpe ratio only rewards you when you actually do a trade. When you don't, or when you miss out on a good opportunity, the Sharpe ratio doesn't care, basically. So this is why the Sharpe ratio, which I found interesting just as an idea, that the Sharpe ratio already included kind of like this idea of the precision rather than accuracy. And if we draw this a bit further, he was also like, one of the main things he did was basically to show this mathematically, under the assumption that we again only have a stop loss and a take profit, and these are the only things we have, basically. So there's a certain probability that we make this amount of money and a certain probability, the counter probability that we lose that money. You can actually show here the relationship between the precision, which is like the percent chance that we hit, and what kind of Sharpe ratio that would result in. And the interesting thing here is that it shows actually if the number of trials or the number of trades goes up, this improves. So with a lower, even with a lower probability or with the same probability, we can get a higher Sharpe ratio if we just do it more often, which kind of responds to this whole idea of a lot of traders say, I only need to be right 51% of the time, right? And over time I'll make money. And this is the concept, basically, that yes, that's true, but then you need to make as many trades as possible, which I find kind of an interesting way to think about like also the strategies that we generate, that maybe it's not right that often, but hey, maybe we can in some way make it trade more often. Maybe the strategy allows that we generate more trades, and if the probability stays the same, we can actually get more Sharpe ratio out of it, which is kind of cool. And if we think this further, again, like I don't really want to go into that, but basically what it says is, now, given that we have a trading rule, which is like a certain stop loss and a take profit and a certain amount of trades, we can then, under these very restricted assumptions, calculate the Sharpe ratio if we have a certain probability of success. And on the other way around, we can also calculate the precision or the probability of success that is required to achieve a certain Sharpe ratio in the other way around. So basically, we can say we need at least this success probability to get this kind of Sharpe ratio under a certain stop loss, take profit, and N. So generally, I find this is taking a lot of things, like oversimplifying a lot of things. For example, in this case, like definitely not taking this triple barrier thing into account, right? If we could potentially, for example, if we don't have a fixed time after which we end the trade, for example, this could go on forever, basically, if we don't hit one of those barriers, and then we basically cannot make a larger and cannot make more trades if the ones we are in are not getting stopped out in any kind of way, for example. So there's a lot of assumptions, basically, but I think it's a cool way to think about it, like on the and this is basically what he also said, what he was that this is kind of like the thing you want to think about when defining strategies, or when thinking about strategies. You don't want to go too deep into like the standard risk measurements, like value at risk or something like that, but rather to see, like, given how many trades we have and how high the probability is of the success of a trade historically, what can I expect, or what's the probability of success over the long run, stuff like that. So yeah, super mathy, but kind of an interesting idea behind it in this case. Yeah, and that's pretty much it from me. Any questions?
Well,
yep, thanks for presentation.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting.
I have a question. So all this stuff that you presented, is it applicable to portfolios that includes several assets, or mostly only one asset? Because as far as I understand, for example, we can't calculate accuracy for a portfolio of 10 assets. And if you constantly rebalance them, there is no way to measure how many of your trades are successful or not.
I'm not 100% sure. I mean, technically, you could still keep track of all the trades, but
yeah, you could keep track of them, but imagine your portfolio consists of 3 assets, and today the share of each asset is equal, so that's 33%, but you want today rebalance your portfolio in a way that you sell second asset and put half of the second asset in the first asset and half of it in the third asset. So in that case, you can't really measure the precision or recall.
True. Yeah, it's definitely not. Yeah, it's also not kind of like a stop loss or take profit in this sense, basically, right? Yeah, I think like especially this is under very restricted assumptions, basically. Yeah, about the accuracy, I'm not sure. I have to think about that.
Okay. And also this standard for performance, how do you call this? Like global something?
This one, you mean?
No, I mean the
Oh,
standard
yeah, yeah.
100
Like
pages.
It is called GIPS.
It's okay. Global investment performance. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So this is going to be our homework to all read this 120 pages. Right. Any more questions? Was it somewhat understandable? Because I mean, yeah, like he is writing super mathy, so I basically tried to, yeah, keep it relatively simple, keep it to the intuition behind it, and not go into the formulas too much.
To me personally, it was understandable. Like there, from the things that you presented, I think there are a lot of ideas that we can try to implement. For example, well, the first thing that comes to mind is this cross-validation. So we already have the cross-validation in the metrics analyzer, but I think there it was slightly different. I think you don't use data from the future to do training like you did here. So maybe it makes sense to, well, first to add using data from the future, and second to add those gaps between the testing data and the training data to even in our case where we don't use yet fractional differencing or those labeling techniques, there is still some correlation, especially for the training data that is after the test data. I mean, it's possible that it contains some information from the test data. So, yes, so that's just one example of things that we can start doing, and yeah, that also there are a lot of other things also. So thank you very much.
No problem.
So I know that there is this repository on GitHub that has some of these, the ideas in this book are implemented there. Maybe there are some primitives that will be implemented in that repository that we can take and just use.
We can do that, but it's probably better to modify, not to just use. Like I looked at some of their code, and some of it, well, the code that I was looking at was very slow for not, I mean, unreasonably so it could have been made better, I think. And I guess that there will be similar problems in other places. So we can use this as a source of inspiration, but maybe it's better to just copy the algorithms.
There's also, I think Tim said that he was also kind of like going through that book, and he said there are some repositories online on GitHub, but they all stopped at some point. So at some point over the book, they all just gave up because it was too complicated. So yeah. but maybe we find something. I think especially like the fractional difference is also in some modules already.
It's not that complicated, so probably it is.
Yeah, I used it from a library directly some time ago. So it was implemented.
Cool. Yeah, I think that this is definitely something we can just use from now on. Instead of returns, use the fractional difference. So it returns.
Okay. So thank you, Jan. Are there any other questions or comments? Alex, are you saying something?
Oh, no, I wasn't mute, sorry.
Okay. No, okay. Okay, so I think we can finish for today. Thank you again, and have a nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.